Tonight, we start with a diplomatic humiliation that defense analysts are calling historic, possibly the biggest shift in Pacific security posture we've witnessed since World War I ended. Japan just made Putin regret every dismissive laugh, not through speeches, not through formal protests, not through empty condemnations. What Tokyo did this week crossed a line Moscow believed would never be tested, because Japan was expected to remain constitutionally pacifist, economically tied to stable relationships, and strategically irrelevant to Russian planning. And when Japan stepped beyond 80 years of post-war restraint, Putin didn't answer with his usual sarcasm. He issued an emergency statement. The country Putin publicly mocked as diplomatically toothless has now deployed capabilities Russian military planners are scrambling to counter, and the Kremlin's casual arrogance has turned into real strategic alarm. Tonight, we break down what Japan did, why Putin never expected it, and why this changes everything in the Pacific. Picture the scene. Inside the Japanese Prime Minister's residence, senior officials cluster around secure communications equipment, staring at live feeds from the Sea of Japan. On the screens, Japanese naval vessels underway, advanced missile systems in motion, deployment confirmations arriving in real time. Among the key figures are Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, a defense hawk who vowed to reshape Japan's security posture, Defense Minister Minu Kihara, directing the largest military expansion since 1945, and Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa, synchronizing the diplomatic messaging. These are the officials who just approved what earlier Japanese governments considered unthinkable, who decided that 8 decades of pacifist restraint had done its job, who concluded that Putin's contempt demanded an answer. They are finalizing deployment orders meant to prove reach, establish presence, and deliver an unmistakable message to Moscow. The room watches closely. They track Russian military communications, and then, one by one, the conclusion locks in. Not protest, not negotiation, not patience, direct action. Japan has just placed advanced military capabilities within striking distance of Russian Pacific installations' capabilities. Moscow had confidently assumed Japan would never put on the board. And think about this. For years there had been signals, quiet signals, not issued through official channels, not shouted in public statements, signals that Japan's patience with Russian dismissiveness was wearing thin. Japan stayed restrained, yes, but increasingly frustrated inside that restraint. Its diplomacy followed a familiar pattern, a rhythm, almost a ritual of futility. What set off alarm bells in Moscow this month was that Japan stopped asking and started acting. Analysts who track Japan's military posture know the warning signs. Accelerated procurement of long-range strike missiles, unprecedented increases in defense budgets, joint exercises with NATO-aligned forces, sudden movement of assets toward disputed territories. This week, all of it converged. And when Japan trades diplomatic patience for military positioning, it means the underlying calculus has changed at a fundamental level. The framework that held for decades because Japan feared China's reaction, because constitutional constraints seemed permanent, and because economic ties with Russia still mattered, has now been transformed. Russia's aggression in Ukraine changed everything. Putin's personal insults toward Japanese leadership sped everything up. Western backing for Japanese rearmament enabled everything. When countries decide that diplomacy equals perpetual humiliation while military strength earns respect, that is when security postures shift. That is when powers rise. So let's be precise about what happened this week, and why Moscow immediately recognized it as a strategic crisis based on intelligence assessments and satellite confirmation. Japan announced and implemented a comprehensive security package involving advanced missile deployments, a stronger naval presence near disputed islands, and direct military aid to Ukraine, measures designed to challenge Russian Pacific dominance, establish credible deterrence, and prove that Tokyo is no longer a passive actor. The package included deployment of Type 12 surface-to-ship missiles with ranges covering Russian Pacific Fleet bases, the announcement of hypersonic missile development programs, tailored specifically for northern contingencies, the direct provision of military vehicles and equipment to Ukrainian forces, and joint exercises with U.S. forces that simulate island recapture scenarios. Foreign Minister Kamikawa, normally known for careful diplomatic phrasing, stated bluntly that Japan would no longer accept Russian occupation of the northern territories, that the islands are Japanese sovereign territory, that Russia's position is illegitimate, and that Japan will take all necessary measures to demonstrate resolve. When Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova brushed the announcement off as irrelevant posturing, Tokyo answered with action. We've listened to Russia dismiss us for decades now. We will make sure they can hear our capabilities. Defense officials reinforced this through joint announcements with Washington. Within hours of the Japanese deployments, briefings were circulating across Allied capitals throughout the Indo-Pacific. The shared assessment was stark and unanimous. Japan has decisively ended its post-war pacifist posture, and Russia now faces a two-front strategic problem it is not prepared to handle. One senior Pentagon official, speaking on background, described it as a sleeping giant finally waking up because Japan's industrial and technological power, once mobilized for defense, reshapes Pacific dynamics at the most basic level. Putin built his Pacific strategy around Japanese passivity. For decades, Russian confidence held because Japan's constitution blocked offensive capabilities, because Tokyo prioritized economic stability over territorial disputes, and because no Japanese government would risk confrontation. That foundation has now collapsed. Japan has shown it will deploy strike capabilities. It will provide military aid to Russia's enemies. It will coordinate with NATO. And it will no longer tolerate diplomatic humiliation. Most devastating of all, Japan has concluded that Putin's dismissiveness was weakness dressed up as strength. When nations learn that politeness produces contempt, while power compels respect, that's when decades of restraint end and regional orders begin to transform. Moscow's reaction this week was not confident dismissal. It was not mocking condescension. It was not staged indifference. It was barely concealed alarm. Official after official labeled Japan's moves destabilizing and provocative and, most importantly, something requiring immediate military countermeasures. But intimidation only works when the target backs down. Japan did not. In fact, Tokyo's response this week was among the most assertive we've seen since 1945. Here's what we know. Within 48 hours of Moscow's protest, Japan announced faster missile deployment timelines, additional naval exercises near contested waters, expanded intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and new defense agreements with the Philippines and Australia. These were not symbolic gestures. These were strategic commitments, policy actions Japan takes only when core security assumptions have shifted. Tokyo confirmed that deployments would proceed regardless of Russian objections. Japan moved before Russia could seize escalation dominance. It pushed to forward positions, announced additional capabilities, and broadened its alliance network. Put simply, Japan answered Russian protests by doubling down. That is what makes the shift so significant. Russia's intimidation tactics didn't just fail, they backfired. Instead of producing retreat or hesitation, they triggered acceleration. Japan didn't soften its stance, didn't seek compromise, didn't dilute its message. It hardened its posture and expanded its commitments. And here is where the story grows even more consequential. Intelligence analysts now believe Putin's dismissiveness toward Japan was meant to exploit what he saw as post-war trauma and constitutional limits. He wanted to test whether Japan would accept permanent inferiority, whether economic concerns would override territorial claims, whether a pacifist culture would block military responses. For decades, it worked until this week, when the opposite happened. Japan refused the constraints. It broke from 80 years of restraint so openly so decisively that even Putin could not pretend it was irrelevant. You don't trigger Japanese remilitarization by accident, but in this decade, Putin did it systematically, and Tokyo responded accordingly. The psychological impact on Putin may be the most important part of this development. He built his Pacific position around Russian military dominance over a passive Japan. His Far East strategy depends on Tokyo staying strategically irrelevant. This week shattered that assumption. Putin cannot ignore Japanese military capabilities because they now threaten Russian Pacific installations, but he also cannot properly address them because so much of his force is tied down in Ukraine. He is trapped between dismissing a rising threat and admitting strategic overextension. That trap, combined with battlefield losses in Ukraine, creates conditions where Russian options narrow fast. Defense analysts describe Russia's Pacific posture as strategically exposed, a vulnerability Japan is now actively exploiting. Japanese remilitarization creates cascading effects across Pacific security on multiple levels. First, it signals that post-war constraints are ending, meaning this is not a temporary adjustment but a permanent strategic change. Second, it tells China that Japan will resist territorial pressure, complicating Beijing's calculations. Third, it tells Russia its Pacific assets are now vulnerable, stretching already strained military resources. Fourth, it sends unmistakable signals to South Korea and Taiwan that regional resistance is building. Fifth, it inevitably accelerates U.S. strategic commitments, deepening alliance integration. Now we have to talk about historical parallels, because Japan has transformed like this before, and understanding that history is why analysts say this moment is pivotal. The most relevant comparison is the Meiji Restoration, when Japan shifted from an isolated feudal society into a modern military power within a single generation. Japan proved it could adapt at astonishing speed, modernizing faster than any nation in history, and Western powers that dismissed Japan as backward learned otherwise at Port Arthur in 1905. The result was Japan's emergence as a major power that reshaped Asian geopolitics for a century. Another parallel is Japan's post-war economic miracle, when a devastated country became the world's second-largest economy through focused national effort, again proving that rapid transformation is culturally embedded. Russia is now confronting that same Japanese capacity for strategic reinvention, the ability to change national posture faster than adversaries can adjust. The dismissiveness that worked for decades no longer applies. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Japan's transformation is unfolding while Russia is maximally distracted. Russian military hardliners want resources shifted to the Pacific. Commanders focused on Ukraine want continued emphasis on the Western Front. Economic advisors want lower military spending. Putin wants to maintain the fiction that everything is under control. He's managing all of those pressures while simultaneously facing a new Pacific threat he cannot adequately address. And leaders in that position don't respond from strength. They respond from desperation. They respond from denial. The strategic consequences for Russia are severe, and they create both opportunities and risks. The opportunity for Japan and its allies is straightforward. Russia cannot fight effectively on two fronts. Tokyo has already shown it will deploy capabilities, provide aid to Ukraine, and coordinate with Western partners. If Japanese military modernization continues as current budgets indicate it will, Russia will face a durable strategic encirclement it lacks the resources to counter. But the risk is just as serious. A Putin who feels cornered may authorize provocations. Russia-China coordination could intensify, nuclear signaling could increase, and that carries implications far beyond the Pacific. The question facing Tokyo is no longer whether to keep modernizing current commitments suggest that is irreversible, but how quickly to expand capability while managing regional stability. Those who call this Japan's strategic awakening understand that transformation creates opportunity, but also responsibility. The opportunity is clear. permanent escape from post-war limitations. The danger is also clear, the possibility of provoking an already unstable Russia. Remember, Putin assumed Japan was strategically irrelevant. He assumed mockery would produce submission. He assumed the Pacific flank was secure. But tonight, Japanese missiles point toward Russian bases. Japanese aid flows to Ukraine. And Putin isn't laughing anymore. Let's bring this full circle to where we began tonight, to that moment when Japanese officials approved what 80 years of post-war restraint had once forbidden. That moment represents more than a set of deployments. It represents the end of an era. The instant Putin's mockery collided with Japanese capability, consider what it means that Japan is deploying strike weapons. Consider what it means that Japan is directly aiding Ukraine. Consider what it means that Putin's Pacific flank is now contested. This is not a temporary tweak. It is a permanent transformation, one that forces every future Russian calculation to account for a power Moscow spent decades dismissing. And here is the deeper truth about strategic awakenings. They often look sudden, but they are built from accumulated frustrations outsiders fail to notice until action arrives. Japan seemed passive until it wasn't. Post-war constraints looked permanent until they weren't. Putin's contempt followed the same pattern. Effective until it triggered the very response it was meant to prevent. Now Japan is responding, and the Pacific will never be the same. Tonight, one thing is unmistakable. Japan has ended 80 years of post-war restraint. Russia faces a new strategic threat it cannot counter. Putin's mockery has produced his nightmare. And tonight, for the first time since what one briefing even called the World War Bay era, Japan is a military power with global reach and regional ambition. Moscow is recalculating, frantically recalculating. And when the Kremlin recalculates with this kind of urgency, it means they know something has fundamentally changed. Because this week, Putin learned something he never wanted to learn. Japan was never weak, only patient. That patience is over, and the laughter has stopped. This story is far from finished. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good.